Welcome to American Carnage. This is our fifth and final episode in our series on the life and times of the radical abolitionist John Brown. This episode is titled, A Great White Light. Throughout this whole five-part series, and thank you again so much for sticking with us through 5 episodes now, but throughout this series, we've been dancing around what I think is a key and fundamental question that I think I've been evading, to be honest, in part because I haven't been sure exactly how to answer it. And the question that I think I've been circling around is, how exactly is it that John Brown's raid at Harpers Ferry leads to the emancipation of the slaves? You hear people all the time assert, and I think I've personally been guilty of this, you hear people assert that Brown's raid leads to the freeing of the slaves. But, to my mind, this is kind of an unsatisfactory answer, an unsatisfactory thing to say. Because, right, you want to ask, how exactly does one thing lead to the other? What is the mechanism by which the violent raid at Harpers Ferry culminates in the emancipation of the slaves? And I think it's fair to say that there's a ton of hand-waving going on when you see this question brought up and answered. You see this for sure in the history books, but I think also on Twitter and on social media, and when you just talk to people casually about John Brown, I think even when there's a vague awareness that these things are linked, that the raid at Harpers Ferry is linked to the emancipation of the slaves, even for all the people out there who I love, all you guys with your John Brown avatars, I think many of them have a hard time actually answering this question. The responses you typically get go something like, step 1, John Brown invades Harper's Ferry with a bunch of men trying to liberate the slaves. The invasion is put down and John Brown and his men are executed. Step 2 is, question mark, question mark, question mark, question mark. And then step 3 is a few years after the raid, the Civil War starts and the slaves are liberated as part of that. And when you aren't rushing through these things, your mind wants to stop and ask you to slow down and say, so what happens in the middle of that? What is that second step? Are we saying that John Brown's raid at Harpers Ferry is the reason the Civil War began? And if so, how and why did that happen? And so this is really going to be the subject of today's episode, trying to understand exactly how or if it was that John Brown's raid at Harpers Ferry was directly linked to the abolition of slavery in the U.S. just a few years later, and what that tells us, if anything, about the process by which political change is actually effectuated in this country. I think it's worth saying that there are many historians who are very skeptical about the notion that Brown's raid is really in any grand sense responsible for the end of slavery. As you can tell, I think, pretty clearly from our first 4 episodes, I have a lot of fun grabbing the popcorn and watching from the sidelines as various historians just, yell and snipe at each other over, these big questions in the historical record. And there's this one historian, H.W. Brands, at the University of Texas, Austin, who will really make clear, in his view at least, that it's really not John Brown who deserves the lion's share of the credit for sparking the end of slavery. And while this alone doesn't make him correct, of course, I actually think Brands almost certainly has the majority of the country on his side, right? If you lined up, let's say, 100 Americans, just picked randomly from the population, and you asked them the question, who is responsible, above all else, for freeing the slaves? I feel pretty confident in saying that almost all of them, probably more than 90%, right, are going to give the same answer. And that answer, of course, is Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president. It is, after all, Abraham Lincoln who signs the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, freeing the slaves in the states that had already seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy. This is a wartime measure that Lincoln signs. It is, of course, Abraham Lincoln who will push through Congress and then sign the 13th Amendment that fundamentally abolishes slavery and deems it to be unconstitutional in 1865. It is Abraham Lincoln who gets his face on the $5 bill and his statue on the western end of the National Mall and his appearance forever chiseled onto Mount Rushmore. And what Brands will say, for I think totally understandable and logically coherent reasons, is that, without Abraham Lincoln holding the national mass of public opinion together, without Abraham Lincoln showing the political pragmatism and dexterity that was necessary to get elected and to eventually lead the nation through this war that was very controversial, without all of that sort of political finesse, nothing would have been done to lead to the emancipation of the slaves. Nothing would have been possible to lead to the emancipation of the slaves without Lincoln doing that. Brands will sort of suggest that you could have another Harpers Ferry-like raids on the South, and slavery may have survived, another few decades at least. I mean, right, no slaves are freed by John Brown's raid at Harpers Ferry, but the argument goes, at least, millions will be freed by the strokes of Abraham Lincoln's pen. Brands writes, quote, "The question had been, what does a good man do when his country commits a great evil? John Brown chose the path of violence and Lincoln of politics. But Brown aimed at slavery and shattered the Union. Lincoln defended the Union and destroyed slavery. Brown's path had the advantage of immediacy. It was soul-satisfying to him, perhaps to his followers who lost their lives pursuing his vision, and definitely to those who praised Brown from a safe distance. And yet it was Lincoln who did more good for the black race than any American before him. Lincoln could not have done other than he had done. He could not have been other than he was and served the black slave so well," end quote. And yet, of course, there are going to be obvious counter-arguments to what Brands is saying here, because other historians like Louis DeCaro Jr. will point out not just that Lincoln leaves the historical record littered with some very racist pronouncements, not just that Lincoln appeared and acted much more preoccupied with saving the Union than freeing the slaves, but I think, above all else, that if Brown needed Lincoln to finally push through the legal changes that effectively eliminated slavery, then without Brown, you do not have the conditions that make it possible for Lincoln to move forward that legislation. And what historians like DeCaro will say, which I think is inarguably true, is that the political institutions of the United States had firmly declared slavery in the South was not to be interfered with. And some historians will say it is John Brown, and emphatically not Abraham Lincoln, who will force those institutions to change, who will force them to confront the question that both political parties had ruled really even through the election of 1860 to be outside the bounds of politics. This is a fight that, again, by all accounts, Lincoln himself had wanted to avoid. Remember that the newfound Republican Party is formed in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act to stop the expansion of slavery, not to interfere with it in the South where it already existed, but to stop it from expanding west and north. There were always some radical factions within the party that were explicitly abolitionist, but complete unconditional emancipation was never part of the Republican Party's platform. And so what some historians will say, and I think with good reason, is that John Brown and the radical abolitionists like him are absolutely indispensable for beginning the process of forcing people to reckon with the question of how do we actually eliminate slavery in a way that Abraham Lincoln does not deserve credit. And yet, even among those who think that Brown deserves credit for, sparking the end of slavery, there is still a lot of debate and contention about, what exactly it was that Brown did or was intending to do that led to that process to unfold and how exactly it unfolded. The historian Tony Horwitz, for instance, will advance what I've heard referred to as the Samson theory of Harper's Ferry, that we should really understand, Tony Horwitz says, we should understand Brown as behaving like the Samson figure of the Bible, that this is the only way to make sense of John Brown's actions. And for those of you who don't know, in the book of Judges in the Old Testament, the Israelite warrior Samson, after losing his vision, will make himself a prisoner to his rivals, the Philistines. And when the Philistines bring Samson as a prisoner into their temple, Samson will use his super strength to tear down the column that's holding up the temple. And when he does so, it collapses the entire building and it kills both himself and his enemies, the Philistines, simultaneously. At the end of episode 4, I described how so many historians have just been baffled by why on earth it is that John Brown decides to stay in Harper's Ferry into Monday, October 17th, when he and his men had hours and hours to run like hell for the Blue Ridge Mountains where they could have escaped and maybe drawn more freedmen to his banner. And so maybe Tony Horowitz, this historian, will suggest maybe this is why John Brown doesn't leave. because he's in the process of tearing down the columns of the temple on top of himself and the slaveholders, the way, Samson tore down the columns on top of himself and the Philistines. Maybe Brown always intended to give up his life as a martyr as a way of appealing to the nation to end slavery. It will probably not surprise you, based on all of our other episodes, that some of John Brown's most ardent defenders, like the historian Louis DeCaro Jr., will say that this is totally baloney, that, yeah, maybe Brown got stupidly bogged down and he should have left when he could and when he had the chance, but that, DeCaro will say military leaders can make mistakes and get their men killed without being intentional about it. Brown himself will stress over and over again before his execution that he tremendously regrets not leaving Harpers Ferry sooner, which I agree is sort of hard to reconcile that statement with the idea that Brown self-consciously styled the raid as this kind of suicide mission. But I think there's actually something to the idea, which I think both Horowitz and DeCaro would certainly agree with, that whether he meant to get himself killed or not, that Brown is going to destabilize the South through his raid by making it so paranoid, so almost insane, that the South itself became kind of suicidal, regardless of whether John Brown intentionally got stuck at Harper's Ferry or not. This is, I think, the central, inarguable way that Brown's raid, that everyone agrees that this changed the trajectory of U.S. politics. After John Brown's raid, the political faction in the South known as the Fire Eaters, this is a pro-slavery faction that wants to secede from the Union, and right up until the point of John Brown's raid, they are in the minority in the South. This is the faction in the South that wants immediate secession from the Union. Again, before Harper's Ferry, they are a marginal force in the South. And then after Harper's Ferry, almost immediately, they will sweep to power across governor's offices and state legislatures and into the halls of Congress. In 1860, for instance, the Fire Eaters will get behind a guy named John C. Breckinridge for the presidency. And this, for the first time, will split the National Democratic Party coalition. And this, above all else, is what will allow Abraham Lincoln to win the presidency on a plurality of the vote, meaning less than a majority. The historian David Reynolds will write, quote, "Disunionism had been relatively weak. The Fire Eaters' argument about the wicked aggressiveness of the Northern abolitionists would have carried little weight if John Brown had not attacked Harper's Ferry. The secessionists manipulated the post-Harper's Ferry frenzy to break apart the Democratic Party, dividing Lincoln's opponents. Had Lincoln's opposition been unified under a single candidate, as in normal times, Lincoln would have almost certainly been defeated. The Civil War would have been delayed, and slavery would have continued until, in all probability, an even more catastrophic war could have occurred later on. And what is even to guarantee that the North could have won that war?" End quote. Reynolds will go as far as to ask us to remember the scene in It's a Wonderful Life, starring Jimmy Stewart, where Jimmy Stewart's character is forced to envision a world in which he had never been born. And as you know from seeing the film, most of you at least, this is a dystopian hellscape without Jimmy Stewart in it. And Reynolds asks us to ponder something similar to John Brown. And he says that it could have been decades, if not as much as a half century, without John Brown acting, that you would not have seen the abolition of slavery. Reynolds will emphasize that the South had really dug in on its defenses of slavery, not just as a necessary evil, but as a positive good. And in fact, I actually didn't know this before reading Reynolds' book, but that the South was in the process of bringing back the international slave trade, which you might remember was abolished way back in 1808. Reynolds points out that Southern politicians start arguing that they're doing Africans a favor by bringing people over as slaves, and that there's every reason to believe that that would have continued to intensify without the Civil War starting when it did. And so the key argument of people like Reynolds, of historians like Reynolds, will be that John Brown's raid could have saved tons of lives and ended slavery early, primarily through this process of driving the South crazy, of convincing the South that it had to secede as soon as possible to protect itself from more John Brown-like raids, and that this secession ended up being disastrous to the South's own self-interest, its own material interest, and that is what culminated in the Civil War that would abolish slavery. But I actually think this is not even capturing, to me, a hugely important part of the story, because I think something else happens that is absolutely pivotal to making this whole thing go, this whole engine that we've been discussing, that leads to the abolition of slavery, that would not have happened without John Brown's raid. And that gets us back to the core question of what it was exactly that John Brown did that ended slavery. Because for as much as I love all the contemporary historians, including Reynolds, what they miss, I think, a little bit is something that the great Black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois captured over 100 years ago in his biography of Brown. And forgive me for paraphrasing a little bit, but what Du Bois essentially argues is that, maybe John Brown could not have won a general election in 1860 the way Abraham Lincoln did. And that, maybe Lincoln's moderation was necessary to compel the North into the Civil War in a way that was ultimately necessary for ending slavery, which John Brown and his little crew of raiders could not have pulled off on their own. But that, Du Bois will say, the fundamental thing that John Brown did that was so crucial to ending slavery that would not have been possible without it, the absolutely necessary precondition, is that he got men throughout the country, in the North at least, to listen to that little voice that we all have somewhere in the back of our heads, the one that exists outside or somehow above politics, that exists latent within us, beyond our expressed convictions and the order of things as we are told that they should be, that we have come to accept as frozen and immutable. For the reasons I'm about to discuss, the crucial events and the story of this episode, from the disintegration of John Brown's raiders at Harpers Ferry, to his incredibly bold stand at the end of his raid, to his renowned conduct at his trial while he's still a bloody mess from the wounds that he sustained, and then finally to his stoic, gallant end at the gallows, you have to understand that in many ways, all of these actions are a conscious attempt by John Brown to gently cultivate this inner voice, to amplify it and to grow it, like you would tend to a delicate plant in a garden. Because miraculously, W. Du Bois will say, this attempt by John Brown will work. And what Du Bois will say is that it's this moment of national pathos, provoked through the elicitation of dormant or unacknowledged moral sentiment and compassion and empathy, that will above all else prove the propellant that ends slavery. And that it's John Brown, again, for reasons we'll discuss at length, that John Brown will, through his actions, force this moment of national moral reckoning. The Civil War was about slavery, but Lincoln could not have prosecuted it if Union men and Union women throughout the country believed that slavery was morally fine or morally neutral. For all the endless debate about John Brown for over a century, the most important reverberation of Harper's Ferry is the one that happens privately in its immediate aftermath between the temples of men and women that convince hundreds of thousands of men to ultimately be willing to risk their lives in the great cause of freedom that the nation had until that point seemed so utterly unwilling for more than 2 centuries to confront. And it's this process from everything I've read in the primary sources that appears absolutely crucial to convincing the South that they had to secede. If John Brown's rebellion had occurred and simply been condemned by everyone in the North uniformly, I think there is really almost zero chance that you get the Civil War. Because if that had been the case, if the North had just said, this guy is a terrorist lunatic wingnut who we can just ride off, the South would have felt assured that, yes, everyone agrees with them and that they have nothing to worry about. But what's key to understanding John Brown's conduct throughout the events we're going to be discussing today is that he actually makes people in the North agree with him, that they're going to march in his honor and sing songs in his name and mourn his execution, and that it's this moral move in the North, this agreement of him with public opinion, that will above all else provoke the South to secede as the slaveholders watch in horror what's going on in the North. And then that in turn will set off this weird feedback thing that is, I think, the key to understanding what's going on here, because people in the North will begin to praise John Brown, and it will make people in the South even more paranoid about this whole slavery thing and more likely to talk of secession and other extreme measures, which will cause people in the North to talk even more sympathetically about John Brown, which will lead the South to take even more dramatic actions and steps and rhetoric to confront the North. And then you get this cycle that just goes on and on and on. But this whole cycle is only possible, it's only set off by what Du Bois describes, which is that John Brown will speak to the inner conscience of the people of the North and activate it as perhaps few men ever had or have since. Du Bois writes, quote, "Slavery is wrong," John Brown said. "Kill it, destroy it, Uproot it, stem, blossom, and branch. Give it no quarter, exterminate it, and do it now. It is wrong, eternally wrong. It is wrong by whatever name it is called, or in whatever guise it lurks, and whenever it appears. It has to die by revolution, and not by milder means. And this men knew. They had known it for 100 years, and yet they shrank and trembled from it. From round and round about the white and blinding path of John Brown's soul flew equivocations, lies, thievings, and murders. And yet, all men instinctively felt that these things were not of the light, but of the surrounding darkness. There are in this world matters of vast human import which are eternally right or eternally wrong. All men believe this. All men know that there are in this world here and there and again great partings of the ways. The one way wrong, the other right, in some vast and eternal sense. After the world has complacently compromised with a great evil, sometimes there shines suddenly a great white light, an unwavering, unflickering brightness, blinding by its all-seeing brilliance, making the whole world simply a light and a darkness, a right and a wrong. Such a light was the soul of John Brown, end quote. So this is the process through which we're going to look at John Brown's actions, the process by which he begins to work at trying to activate the part of people's brains that will differentiate the world between right and wrong. And it's going to be a difficult journey because remember, the last time we left John Brown in episode 4, he was in the process of more or less royally pissing off the entire country. By 4 p.m. on October 17th, the day after the raid begins, Brown and his men are in deep trouble and things are really desperately beginning to spiral out of control. Brown and his men will begin the invasion, remember, on the evening of October 16th, 1859. By noon the next day, I count at least a half dozen casualties. You'll remember Dangerfield Newby, who was shot and killed by a sniper while retreating through the streets of Harpers Ferry. There's also the freed black porter Hayward Shepherd, who is the first person shot and killed at Harpers Ferry. And compounding the mounting death toll for John Brown at this point, he has a massive logistical problem, which is that his men will be scattered, and it's very hard to get messages back and forth without risking what happened to Newby. Because remember, the buildings and the streets of Harpers Ferry are filled with people who could shoot and kill John Brown's men at any moment and are not exactly sympathetic to his mission. Remember, Brown has stationed a few of his men back in Maryland near the Kennedy farmhouse where they trained, and they're supposed to be serving as a kind of rear guard that can come and help. Brown has a bunch of his men also in the eastern side of the city near the eastern entrance at the Federal Arsenal, Federal Armory, and the Fire Engine House. These are 3 buildings sort of where the bridge from Maryland enters Harpers Ferry. And then Brown has a third contingent of his men under his number 2, John Henry Kagi, that are holding the Harpers Ferry Rifle Works, this little factory located about a half-mile west on the western part of Harpers Ferry, but still a half-mile from the men in the east and even further from where they are in Maryland. Again, let's remember the topography of Harpers Ferry. It's a thin, triangular peninsula. It's cut off to the north by the Potomac River and to the south by the Shenandoah River. These rivers sort of run east-west on the north and south end of Harpers Ferry. And then on the other side of the rivers, there are these massive cliffs and hills. As we've said, there are only 2 bridges into and out of town, and by around 4 p.m. on October 17th, the second day of the raid, militiamen from throughout Virginia and Maryland are converging rapidly on this little town and about to take both bridges. In Harpers Ferry, these militias are sloppy, disorganized, non-professional soldiers. They're not wearing uniforms, and they lack anything resembling formal training. As they begin to retake the town, they start getting drunk and plastered with the local townspeople. It becomes very quickly impossible to control them. To me, they sound a lot like the border ruffians back in Kansas, like the mob that lynched Francis McIntosh and Elijah Lovejoy. And as hundreds of these militiamen begin flocking and pouring into Harpers Ferry, John Brown's men can see them. John Brown's number 2, Henry Kagi, is going to send these extremely alarmed messages to John Brown as he's watching the hills fill up with these militia. This young veteran of the Kansas years named Jeremiah is going to have the highly unenviable task of darting through Harpers Ferry to tell John Brown, hey, we have to get out now. Kagi is sending messages throughout the day to Brown saying, you have to leave right now. Aaron Stevens, we know, Brown's second most senior lieutenant, is also telling Brown, we have to get the hell out of here. I mean, imagine what it must have been like to be one of the 20 or so guys who are part of this raid, and you're stuck waiting for your leader to just finally give the order to get out of this death trap. And as you're waiting throughout the surrounding hills, you can hear and see this crowd of hundreds or maybe thousands of furious white men pouring in. And now imagine that you're not just one of John Brown's raiders, but you're one of John Brown's black raiders. Like the writer Osborne Anderson, who would give the only written account from the perspective of one of John Brown's raiders. And Osborne Anderson knows what potential horrors await him, knowing that he's not only committed treason against his country, but he's doing so as a black man in the South. These white militias from Maryland and Virginia will occupy the larger buildings near where Brown's men are stationed, as well as the tall ridgeline across the rifle works on the other side of town. This is where Kagi's contingent of men are stationed, on the western side of town. And Brown's men can see these militias beginning to take the bridges that are really Brown's only escape. And I mentioned to you earlier this Tony Horowitz theory about how Brown was like Samson from the Bible, intentionally doing a sort of suicide mission to get him and his men killed. And to be honest, one reason I'm kind of skeptical of this thesis is because at this crucial juncture, John Brown is not exactly acting like a terrorist, trying to kill as many men as possible. In fact, he is risking his own life because he's so busy negotiating with the hostages. He's trying to negotiate terms with the hostages for them to come along with him into the mountains. And Brown is saying to his men, let me just work out a deal with these hostages just a little longer, and once that deal is complete, we can escape to the mountains. This is, to me, if anything, suggests that Brown is more concerned with how the rest of the nation will view his actions at Harper's Ferry than he is with trying to simply, do a suicide mission on the South. Because he seems so determined to prove to everyone that he's treating the slaveholders who he's captured in a fair and judicious way. But of course, if you're one of John Brown's men, you do not really care that much about that. You are just trying to get the hell out of there. And this is, I think, Osborne Anderson, this black writer who makes it out somehow from this whole mess. Osborne Anderson will write that he loves John Brown. He praises him as much as possible, but he is furious with Brown's mistake right here, his transgression in not getting out of town earlier. Osborne Anderson will write, quote, between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, armed men could be seen coming from every direction. Soldiers were marching and countermarching. On the mountains, a host of bloodthirsty ruffians swarmed, waiting for their opportunity to pounce upon our little band. Captain Brown was considering a proposition for release from his prisoners, and he passed back and forth from the armory to the bridge, speaking words of comfort and encouragement to his men. Brown said, hold on a little longer until I get matters arranged with the prisoners. The tardiness on the part of our brave leader was sensibly felt to be an omen of evil by some of us, and was eventually to be the cause of our defeat. It was not part of the original plan to hold on to the ferry. But by doing so, time was afforded to carry the news of its capture to several points, and forces were thrown into the place which soon surrounded us. The fighting commenced in earnest after the arrival of fresh troops. Volley upon volley was discharged, and the echoes from the hills, and the shrieks of the townspeople, and the groans of the wounded and the dying all filled the air. End quote. And so John Brown's raiders and his sons are going to fall one by one on the second day of the raid as the afternoon stretches into evening on October 17th, and the prospects for escape or survival go from decent at the start of the day to slim by mid-afternoon, and then to utterly non-existent by evening. If you guys are interested, we would really love to do some bonus episodes devoted exclusively to the fascinating cast of characters who followed John Brown to their deaths at Harper's Ferry. But for now, I just want to give you a snapshot of the grisly, horrific ends some of them will meet here because they decided to risk their lives in the cause of fighting slavery. So remember, I said a handful of Brown's raiders, are on the western part of Harper's Ferry in the rifle works. A handful are back in Maryland, sort of near where they were training as a rear guard. And the bulk of the men at this point are in one of the 3 buildings on the eastern edge of town, right next to the Maryland border. As I said, John Henry Kagi, Brown's second in command, is leading the men on the western edge of town. And with Brown not responding to his urgent pleas that they have to leave, Kagi will say, whatever, I'm going myself. And Kagi and his men make this desperate effort to try to swim south across the Shenandoah River and into freedom in Virginia. From this Rifle Works building, they can see in the middle of the stream, sort of halfway through the river, this large flat rock. And their plan is, if we can avoid the bullets, we can make it to the rock and then make it to the other side of the river and escape, even though there's a contingent of militia who they can see on the other side of the river. Kagi himself will be gunned down almost immediately and his body will drift along the river after it's shot. 2 men will make it to this flat rock. 2 of them will be immediately shot when they get there. I believe those were slaves that Brown had liberated and had joined Brown's raiders. The 2 other men were 2 freed black men, one named Lewis Sheridan Leary and his nephew John Copeland. Leary is riddled with bullets and quickly dies right after. Copeland is taken into custody and shortly after executed. Meanwhile, back in Maryland, Brown's men there have decided that they have no choice but to try to escape, and they disperse. Some of them will be caught, however, and later executed. Back on the eastern part of town, one of Brown's men, a 20-year-old kid really, named Will Lehman, will reach his breaking point. He will panic, seeing the raid falling apart, and will attempt to swim across the northern Potomac River, which runs east-west north of Harpers Ferry. Lehman will wash up on a sandbar in the middle of the river and will be captured by a member of the militia. This 20-year-old will get on his knees and beg for his life, and he will say, "Don't shoot, I surrender." The gunman then blows off Lehman's head, and he leaves the body to rot on this sandbar, and for hours the increasingly drunk and wasted militia use the corpse as target practice until it drifts away in the current. Around this time, John Brown's men will be returning fire from the militia, and one of them will shoot and kill the mayor of Harpers Ferry, who, by all accounts, had been trying to negotiate a ceasefire with Brown's men. And when the mob discovers that this peaceful mayor has been killed, they go ballistic, and they take one of Brown's men who had been captured, his son-in-law Henry Thompson, and they go to execute him. Right before Thompson is executed, he will say to this mob, quote, "Though you may take my life, 80,000 will soon rise up to avenge me and carry out my purpose," end quote. The mob then executes Thompson and throws his body over the parapet of the bridge and into the river below. So now Brown is really just left to the handful of men that he still has on the eastern part of Harpers Ferry, and they will get together and fall back into the Armory's brick engine house, which is, as I said, one of the 3 main buildings on the east side of town. At this point, Brown, knowing that he has to get the hell out of here, will send his son Watson and his top military man, Aaron Stevens, to negotiate a plan in which he will give these hostages their freedom in exchange for he and his men being able to retreat into the Blue Ridge Mountains. But after they leave the engine house, Watson Brown, Brown's son, will be shot through the bowels and have to be immediately pulled back into the engine house by his brother Oliver. Watson Brown will soon bleed to death. Stevens, the number 2, will also be riddled with bullets and just barely makes it out alive with the help, miraculously, of one of Brown's own hostages who, in a bizarre story, will risk his own life and race and save Stevens' life and then turn himself back over to Brown, by becoming a hostage again, even though he could have been free, in one of these weird little stories that emerge in these sort of crises. But Watson Brown will be soon dead. Brown's son Oliver will also be soon shot and then bleed out to death. And Stevens, his top military man, and Kagi, all these people are dead or incapacitated or captured. And this is when the story starts to change, when Brown begins to emerge as a martyr, as a brave underdog who finally stood up against the overwhelming violence and force of the South. Because remember, as I said, ultimately far more powerful than any weapons Brown wields, far more powerful than anything he does in Kansas or at Harper's Ferry, is when he speaks to the inner conscience of the country. And that process is really going to start here at this brick engine house where Brown and his men are surrounded, cut off, and bleeding to death. Because starting at this moment I'm about to describe to you, even the Southerners will have a really hard time denying that Brown seems to represent what Du Bois had talked about. That he seems at this moment, even to the Southerners, to have an iron internal code, an unshakable moral compass that everyone sees exemplified by his battlefield conduct at this moment. By 11 p.m. on this second day of the raid, A detachment of 90 Marines led by Colonel Robert E. Lee will arrive from Washington. They will quickly take control of the town and finally rein in this militia force that's been just going around and killing prisoners of war without so much as a trial. And after he arrives, Colonel Lee, who would of course go on to become General Robert E. Lee, the leader of the treasonous Confederate Army, Colonel Lee will offer Brown one last chance to surrender at dawn. And Lee says that if Brown refuses, the Marines will storm the engine house where Brown's men are massively outnumbered and have no chance of escape. By the next morning, Tuesday, October 18th, 1859, the entire town of Harpers Ferry is gathered just outside the Armory Yard. There are more than 2,000 citizens and militia watching the engine house in rapt anticipation. Lee is dressed in civilian clothes and standing about 40 feet away on a slight elevation, and his top aide, Jeb Stuart, who will later be the hero of the Confederate Army, Jeb Stuart will approach the engine house holding in his hands Lee's drafted order of surrender. The order demands that Brown peacefully lay down his arms and return the quote-unquote pillaged property, which he means the liberated slaves. In return, Lee guarantees Brown's safety until there can be a trial, and if Brown refuses, Stuart is instructed to wave his cap as a signal for the Marine attack on the engine house to begin. Brown, unsurprisingly, refuses these terms. He says that he will only release the hostages if he and his men are allowed to escape into the mountains. Stuart, of course, tells them, that's not going to work. And this, again, is where you see the admiration for Brown begin to grow, as he paces around wielding the sword of Frederick the Great bequeathed to George Washington. Brown tells Jeb Stuart, quote, "You have the numbers on me, but you know we soldiers are not afraid of death. I would as lieve die by a bullet as on the gallows," end quote. Stuart turns and walks back to Lee, waving his cap. 12 Marines are prepared to breach the engine house with orders to kill or capture Brown and his men. Lee has given command of this team to a young lieutenant named Israel Green. In this weird historical twist of fate, Israel Green had accidentally grabbed a flimsy ceremonial dress sword when he was going to Harper's Ferry instead of his regulation saber, which is going to be important in a second. And so as Jeb Stuart walks back waving his cap, the Marines are going to assault the engine house. They try initially to use hammers to batter down the doors, but Brown has them barricaded and the hammers don't work. Jeb Stuart instructs them, and Israel Green and his men grab a ladder and they use it as a battering ram, all while Brown's men shoot at the Marines defending this little fortress. With the second blow of the ladder on the engine house doors, the wood splinters. Lieutenant Green is the first through the doors. The hostage, Lewis Washington, the great-grandnephew of George Washington, will frantically point at John Brown, who's crouched on one knee, trying to reload his rifle. Lieutenant Green will rush Brown and bring his saber down upon his head, cutting the back of his neck and forcing Brown to fall on his side. Green will then try to stab Brown, but the point of his blade will instead strike something hard, maybe Brown's buckle or his rifle or something, and the blade will instead bend on itself, and this will just barely keep John Brown alive. Green will then hammer blows with the hilt of his sword on top of Brown's head, knocking him firmly unconscious. I like Louis DeCaro Jr.'s account of what happened at this point in the raid. Quote, "Upon entering the engine house, Lieutenant Green drew his sword to kill Brown and struck him with such force that the sword bent double. The Marine later said either that it had no point or had struck against something hard in Brown's accoutrements. Perhaps it merely had bent against the force of history. Failing to impale him, Green desperately pummeled Brown's head with the hilt of his sword, opening a gaping wound and knocking him unconscious. And yet Green continued to beat Brown, even after he was down, pleading profusely and completely defenseless. Momentarily, another Marine joined in, thrusting his bayonet into the old man, one thrust piercing his lower abdomen," end quote. And again, I would pinpoint this moment as the beginning of the most important period of John Brown's life, just when he appears to have died. John Brown's mortal earthly crusade, the physical one, the one of flesh and skin and bones, of seized buildings and liberated slaves, that crusade is over. And at this moment, in fact, John Brown is literally unconscious. And yet he is now, at this point, on the precipice of doing more to advance the conditions that will end slavery than anything else he will do. Frederick Douglass will write of this moment, quote, The hour of his physical weakness was the hour of his greatest moral strength. The hour of his defeat was the hour of his triumph. The moment of his capture was the crowning victory of his life. With the Allegheny Mountains for his pulpit, the country for his church, and the whole civilized world for his audience, John Brown was 1,000 times more effective as a preacher than as a warrior, and the consciousness of this fact was the secret of his amazing complacency. Mighty with the sword of steel, he was mightier yet with the sword of the truth. And with this sword, he literally swept the horizon, end quote. And there's going to be this revolution in public opinion that we've been discussing throughout this episode. Because as I've said, the excesses of the South at this moment, particularly contrasted with the calm, collected, precise, moral, and biblical explanations offered by Brown, who, remember, at this point is vastly outnumbered and trapped in the proverbial belly of the beast, is going to make people in the North begin to see this whole Harpers Ferry thing in a completely different light. And again, that's really driven by the fact that the South gets so crazy about this whole thing. Right away, there's a push in Virginia of just court-martialing and executing John Brown without a trial. After that, Brown will be denied his own counsel. The Virginians in this scene that gets talked about over and over again, they will drag John Brown into court while he's still visibly wounded and his face is a mess and he's in extreme pain from an injury to his kidney from this bayonet thrust. And he will be denied his own attorneys again and again. And so there's this surreal scene where John Brown, who's almost on the brink of death and still suffering tremendously from these wounds, Brown will be brought into the courthouse on his cot that he was recovering in. And in protest of not being able to have his own attorneys during the trial and still in tremendous pain, Brown will pull the sheets of the bed over his eyes while the rest of a completely packed courtroom and judges and attorneys and everything just watch, and as the judge proceeds as if everything's totally normal. And then, as Douglas says, most powerful of all is when Brown is finally able to deliver his own defense after recovering from his wounds. It's like he's got like a master's or a PhD in communications or something, because from the moment he regains consciousness in Harper's Ferry to the moment of his execution, Brown is providing sort of like a master class in message discipline. And it's with this massive new megaphone that is given to him from his raid on Harper's Ferry that he is able to hammer again and again and again the fundamental evil and wrongness of slavery and his conviction that the nation will pay a massive price in blood if the U.S. refuses to abandon it. And it's the drama of these moments, the way this lone old man is doing something so improbable with such extreme and bloody sacrifice to his men and his own family, that, as Du Bois said, this will get Northerners to start to ask why they've been unwilling to do anything to confront something that they've for so long turned a blind eye to. We started this podcast by asking the question, what would you have been willing to do to end slavery at the other end of a time machine to the 1850s? And it seems like the key to John Brown's impact on the country is that he forces men in his own day to also ask that question. One of his most popular lines is the following. At one point, one of Brown's Southern interlocutors will ask, "Under what principle do you justify your actions?" And Brown will respond, quote, "Upon the golden rule. I pity the poor in bondage that have none to help them. That is why I am here. Not to gratify any personal animosity, revenge, or vindictive spirit. It is my sympathy with the oppressed and the wrong, that are as good as you and as precious in the sight of God. I want you to understand that I respect the rights of the poorest and the weakest of colored people oppressed by the slave system just as much as I do those of the most wealthy and powerful. That is the idea that has moved me, and that alone. Had I so interfered on behalf of the rich, the powerful, or the so-called great, or on behalf of any of their friends, either father, mother, brother, sister, wife, or children, or any of that class, and suffered and sacrificed what I have in this interference, it would have been all right, and every man in this court would have deemed it an act worthy of reward rather than of punishment," end quote. At another point, Brown will be asked by one of the slaveholders, "How do you justify your acts?" And Brown will respond, quote, "I think, my friend, that you are guilty of a great wrong against God and against humanity. I say it without wishing to be offensive, but I think that it would be perfectly right for anyone to interfere with you so far as to free those who you willfully and wickedly hold in bondage," end quote. And as we've said, the initial reaction to John Brown's raid, even in the North, even among abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison, is to distance themselves from what Brown has done. But when Brown's quotes begin to be disseminated again and again throughout the North, minds start to change. The historian Tony Horowitz writes about how citizens across the North begin mobilizing to show their support of John Brown. When he's executed, they'll hold prayer meetings in his honor, they'll hold 100-gun salutes to commemorate his death, they'll ring bells. The Statue of Liberty atop the State House dome in Connecticut will be draped in black in honor of Brown's execution, according to Horowitz. In Boston, more than 4,000 people will show up to eulogize and honor John Brown. Meeting halls will be crammed full of people who had not up until this point identified as abolitionists, but who will show up to defend John Brown at this moment. There is an upsurge not just in anti-slavery sentiment, but in radical abolitionist sentiment. This is a profoundly new thing that courses through the American Republic in the North at this moment. Henry David Thoreau, the great American writer and transcendentalist, will write of the period in which John Brown begins to have this massive psychological and political impact on the country. Quote, "Years were not required for a revolution of public opinion. Days, nay hours, produced marked changes in this case. 50 who were ready to say, on going into our meeting in honor of John Brown in Concord, that he ought to be hung, would not say that when they came out of the meeting. They heard his words. They read what he said. They saw the earnest faces of the congregation, and perhaps they joined at last in singing the hymn in his praise." End quote. Jefferson Davis, who would of course be the future leader of the Confederacy, is at this point a member of the U.S. Senate, and he will watch as these crowds emerge to celebrate John Brown. And when Davis sees this, he will stand up in the Senate and say, quote, "John Brown and 1,000 John Browns can invade us, and the government will not protect us. To secure our rights and to protect our honor, we will dissever the ties that bind us, even if it rushes us into a sea of blood." End quote. I am not 100% sure that John Brown fully understood this feedback loop we've been talking about between North and South that his trial and execution are going to unleash. But Brown definitely recognizes at least some part of this dynamic, because there's this other weird thing that happens around this point. And remember how angry John Brown seems for much of this show. He just seems so livid, from his physical discomfort at the Anthony Burns story, to his rage-induced killings on the Potawatomi, to his venomous break with the mercenary Hugh Forbes, to his contempt for the cowardice of his ostensible abolitionist allies. And then, in the last few weeks of his life, in his altered and somewhat separate post-raid state, a new kind of peace and tranquility in having taken up what Thoreau would identify as, quote, "the sword of the spirit," will take over John Brown, and he will be convinced that he is wielding it more effectively than he ever wielded any weapon. On November 16, 1859, John Brown will write his wife to say, quote, "My mind is very tranquil, I may say even joyous," end quote. And on November 30th, just ahead of his execution, Brown will write, quote, "I am waiting the hour of my public murder with great composure of mind and even cheerfulness, feeling the strong assurance that in no other possible way could I be used to so much advantage to the cause of good and of humanity, and that nothing either I or all my family have sacrificed or suffered will be lost," end quote. The whole scene of John Brown's trial in the city of Charlestown will have this circus-like atmosphere throughout. I saw one estimate that more than 800 people are going to visit him in prison as he awaits his death, with tons of slaveholders deciding that they wanted to take it upon themselves to argue with this old abolitionist. Several attempts are going to be made on John Brown's life, none of them successful until his actual execution by the state of Virginia. At another moment, John Brown's friends and allies will get together and begin planning a raid to break him out of the Charlestown jail. And just like the legend of Socrates, Brown will refuse to be broken out of prison by his friends and say adamantly that there should be no rescue attempt made in his honor and that he will die there. And this attitude of Brown's is going to crystallize in an answer in an interview he has with Governor Henry Wise of Virginia. And Wise will say essentially to Brown, why would you do this? Why would you throw away your life? And what Brown will say in one of those answers that gets reprinted all over the place is that compared to all eternity, the duration of the cosmos, buying another 10 or 15 or 20 years of life is meaningless compared to what your moral position is in that eternity. Brown will say, quote, Governor, I have, from all appearances, not more than 15 or 20 years the start of you in the journey to that eternity of which you kindly warn me. And whether my tenure here shall be 15 months or 15 days or 15 hours, I am equally prepared to go. There is an eternity behind and an eternity before, and the little speck in the center, however long, is but comparatively a minute. The difference between your tenure and mine is trifling, and I want to therefore tell you to be prepared. I am prepared. All you slaveholders have a heavy responsibility, and it behooves you to prepare more than it does me." End quote. On November 2nd, 1859, John Brown will be sentenced to death by hanging by the Commonwealth of Virginia on the charges of treason, murder, and, quote, conspiring with Negroes to produce insurrection. John Brown will say on the day of his execution, quote, "The court acknowledges, as I suppose, the validity of the law of God. I see a book kissed here, which I suppose to be the Bible, or at least the New Testament, that teaches me that all things whatsoever I would that men should do to me, I should do even so to them." Matthew 7:12. It teaches me further to remember them that are in bonds as bound with them. Hebrews 13:3. I endeavored to act up to that instruction. I believe that to have interfered as I have done, as I have always freely admitted I have done, in behalf of his despised poor, was not wrong, but right. Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherances of the end of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of my children, and with the blood of millions in this slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I submit, so let it be done." End quote. The scene of John Brown's execution is it's going to be breathtakingly gorgeous. On December 2nd, 1859, Brown will be taken from his cell and loaded onto a furniture wagon drawn by 2 white horses. Brown will sit on his own coffin, one made of black walnut, and will be escorted to the gallows at the mouth of a wide, expansive cornfield in the Shenandoah Valley region of Western Virginia. One witness there will describe the backdrop to John Brown's execution as, quote, one of broad and fertile fields, dotted with corn shocks and white farmhouses glimmering through leafless trees, end quote. As the wagon approaches the gallows, John Brown will look over the hills and say, quote, "This is a beautiful country. I have not cast my eyes over it before," end quote. The old man will arrive at his gallows flanked by infantry, lieutenants, generals, cavalry, and even artillery. Beyond a massive military presence of at least 1,500 soldiers, there's a massive public crowd of an additional 1,000 civilians, according to the historian Louis DeCaro Jr. Before leaving his jail cell, John Brown will scrawl a note and give it to his jailer, who he had befriended and become quite close friends with. We've spoken so much throughout this podcast about the idea that John Brown viewed his acts of political violence as intended to free the slaves, and therefore worthy, if not necessary, whatever his contemporaries and future generations of historians have said. And what John Brown says in this, his final note to the world, is essentially that, at least at the end, he viewed the political violence he committed as necessary not just to stop slavery, but to stop more bloodshed overall. Brown will say that he wanted to free the slaves with raids like Harpers Ferry because even as that risked some bloodshed, it would risk far less bloodshed than the Civil War itself that John Brown was beginning to have premonitions would occur. John Brown's final note will read, quote, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed, it might have been done," end quote. Among those there to witness Brown's death will be some of those most responsible for the bloodshed in the Civil War. Major Thomas Jackson, later the Stonewall Jackson, who would become a celebrated hero of the Confederacy, he will be in attendance. John Wilkes Booth, who is then a young actor in Richmond and later Abraham Lincoln's assassin, he will sneak onto the train carrying the volunteer militia to Charlestown and also attend the execution. As the wagon carrying John Brown rolls to a stop, a slaveholder ties John Brown's ankles and throws a hood over his head, and then he fastens the noose. There actually had been a sort of competition to provide the tether that finished off the abolitionist. Ropes had been sent by citizens of South Carolina, Missouri, and Kentucky, all of whom had competed for the honor of hanging John Brown. The Kentucky rope will be deemed the strongest. The rope fastened to his neck, John Brown stands atop a trapdoor that's going to open up underneath him. Asked if he wished to signal when he was ready, Brown responds, quote, "No, I am ready at any time, but do not keep me needlessly waiting," end quote. What the thousands of Southerners gathered here are looking for is any sign, no matter how small, that John Brown is wavering, that the physical body is betraying signs of mental and spiritual unrest, that somehow the psychological weapon that Brown is unleashing on the country is maybe defective, because they believe that if they see John Brown tremble, if he shows cracks in his steadfastness, they will at least believe that they have confirmation that John Brown does not represent the vision of moral righteousness that Brown has promised that he represents. Brown will give them no such satisfaction. One witness, a slaveholder from the South, would later write, quote, "I was standing close to John Brown and watched him narrowly to see if I could perceive any signs of shrinking or trembling in his person. But there were none. Once I thought I saw his knees tremble. It was only the wind blowing his loose trousers," end quote. The drop is going to be short, in fact, too short, only roughly 18 inches, and John Brown will die a slow, agonizing death, his body shuddering in spasms, his fists clenching and unclenching as he asphyxiates. For roughly 35 minutes, John Brown's body will dangle in the air, his body rotating in a circle, as his coat skirts flitter loosely in the breeze. We're told that this crowd of more than 2,500 people is completely silent, almost eerily silent, as John Brown's body, with the sack over its head, twists and rotates in the wind. John Brown had shaken off his mortal coil. The examiners would later find his eyes bloodshot red and protruding out of his skull. His face was filled with red blood. His executioners had left him up there for so long that the rope had cut the length of a finger into his neck. His face was mangled by contusions and badly twisted and deformed. And yet, the historian Louis DeCaro Jr. will write that the Southerners are somehow still not convinced that he is dead. The doctors will wait inexplicably for hours and hours and hours before making the final pronouncement that he's dead, almost like they fear that he will still be brought back to life. They will perform 2 separate examinations on John Brown's corpse before marching it back, still under heavy guard, to the Charlestown jail. In the days that follow, the most ferocious of the fire eaters, the Southerners who wanted immediate secession, they will insist that John Brown's head be cut off from its body before he is allowed to go back to his final resting place in North Elba and be reunited with his family. But even the Southerners at this point began to recognize that severing Brown's head from its body would do little to loosen the tightening grip of the old abolitionist on the psyche of the nation. Up in Massachusetts, news of John Brown's death will reach Henry David Thoreau as it reaches the rest of the country. And what Thoreau will essentially say is that even though Brown is dead, he cannot stop thinking about John Brown. Thoreau will say, in essence, and I have to say, Thoreau, I completely relate to you, that John Brown has completely taken over his thoughts. Thoreau will in fact say that he is so absorbed in everything about John Brown that he will look up at the sky at night and be amazed that the Little Dipper keeps showing up in the night sky. That's how much John Brown amazes Thoreau, that he cannot believe that all the stars in the sky have not ceased their usual operations to fixate on John Brown, the way that Thoreau himself cannot tear himself away from fixating on John Brown. And what Thoreau says is that even as John Brown's body, with the head still attached to it, even as it heads north to be reunited with a tearful wife and mourning children and throngs of sympathetic onlookers, that the soul of the man who did more than anyone else in American history to end its single greatest sin, that the soul of that man, Thoreau says, will in fact go marching on, and that, in fact, it does still go marching on to this day within us, beating in the heart of every American who pushes for racial and social harmony, who sacrifices some part of himself for the consecration of the nation's higher ideals. The night of John Brown's executions, the Southerners around Charleston will notice mysterious lights shooting off into the night sky. One appears to answer another, and are described by the Southerners as these great balls of fire, or some sort of fiery meteor erupting in the black night sky. We know now, as the historian Gene Libby would write more than a century later, that these were almost certainly signs of defiance set off by the slaves in the vicinity who were communicating with each other signs of solidarity with John Brown by setting off these lights, setting them off from solid ground from which they could not yet escape. Thoreau writes of John Brown's death, quote, "I heard, to be sure, that he was hung, but I did not know what that meant, and I felt no sorrow in that account. Not after any number of days shall I believe it. Of all the men who were said to be my contemporaries, it seemed to me that John Brown was the only one who had not died. I meet him at every turn. He is more alive now than he ever was. He has earned immortality. He is not confined to North Elba nor to Kansas. He is no longer working in secret. John Brown works in public and in the clearest light that shines on this land." Thank you guys so much for listening and subscribing to our American Carnage podcast and for listening to our first 5 episodes ever, this show about John Brown. We really hope you enjoyed it as much as we had fun making it. We hope you stick around. We have 3 episodes of bonus content planned and in the works for release in the next few weeks. 2 of these will cover John Brown's time in Missouri. One of them will be about John Brown's sexiest raider at Harpers Ferry. We think that episode will be a lot of fun. We hope you'll listen. We'd also really love and appreciate your help trying to figure out who we want to do our next series about. We've thought about Harriet Tubman, or maybe we'll cover Sherman's March. But if you stick around, we'd love your input and help figuring out who our next subject will be for our next series. Lastly, I just wanted to give a huge thanks to all the people who made this possible, without whom we'd never been able to do this. Of course, above all, my best bud, Rolly Amato, who edited and had incredible patience throughout this series. Our producer, Sophia Curzius, without whom we could never have done this. Again, the theme music was by Ned Porter. We had the John Brown's Body outro by Stephen Griffith and the artwork by Elena Lacey. Thank you guys so much. And lastly, thank you so much to my wife, Sophia Crutchfield, and my friends, Karthik and Deirdre, for helping me think through this series and what I wanted to say with it. Couldn't have done it without you guys either. And stick around, and thanks so much for listening.
John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His soul is marching on. He's gone to be a soldier in the army of the Lord. He's gone to be a soldier in the army of the Lord. He's gone to be a soldier in the army of the Lord. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His soul is marching on.